Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and today I'm going to go ahead and give you guys my workflow when I'm coloring an image. It's taken me a really long time to come up with a workflow that I feel comfortable with sharing with other people. Now, this isn't the way to color. This is just
a way to color.
Okay, there's thousands of different ways to color an image, and just to lighten the load for the workflow and everything for me, because when it's all said and done, this video took 12 hours for me to actually do, just with the coloring alone. Now, the images that are appearing on the screen right now, thus far throughout the video, these are images that I personally have drawn and colored. Now, it's only until recently that I've actually found and utilized the workflow that I'm going to be showing you guys inside of this video. But when I found this workflow, I felt like I had hit some sort of major breakthrough, and I'm sharing it with you right now. Now, if I were to narrate each and every little thing that I did inside of a 12-hour drawing session or coloring session, the video would wind up being an hour and 30 minutes long. And I know that for a fact because I actually tried to edit this video down doing that. I spent my entire holiday weekend doing it, and in the end I didn't think it was worth it. So I've gone ahead and drawn out a mediocre sketch and kind of put a video within a video. So there's going to be segments inside of this video where you're going to see me draw out this mediocre image, and I'm going to teach what it is that I'm doing at each different part of the video. And then it's going to resume with a speed paint to see just the power of each and every single step that I'm showing you. Now, like I said, I'm going to be coloring an image from Jazza's Coloring Book. This image specifically. I purchased this from Jazza's Coloring Book. If you guys are interested in getting Jazza's Coloring Book, it's a good one, by the way. Just go onto your web browser, type in drawwithjazza.com. I'm really a big fan of how his website just looks so sleek. His old one, it looked nice, but it was starting to look a little bit dated, I'll admit that. Go into the shop right at the top of the screen there. There's a tab up there, and right there at the top, you'll just find for $6 you can get Jazza's coloring ebook, and it winds up being sent over to you through your email. I've just had this coloring book sitting around for so long, and I've been wanting to color in it, and this is my opportunity to do it. So I'm going to make this really simple for you guys with these little demonstrations, okay? So currently with Jazza's Coloring Book, I already have the line work. But in this case, you know, I'm just going to go ahead and draw out a power line, something really simple, okay? Like power line as in like telephone poles and stuff like that. Okay, so that's our power line, all right? And so I would call this layer line work. Okay, and then I locked it just now. So inside of the video, I actually use a different workflow in order to do this first step. But just to show you the alternative step, I'm going to go ahead and use the lasso tool here. Okay, so I go ahead and create a new layer right here, and then I put it underneath my line work. I select both layers and press Ctrl G in order to create a group. I select this new layer and call it full, okay? That's just my default name for it, and then I select the lasso tool. And normally I would create a selection of this whole object really super carefully, but for this really quick demonstration, I'm just going to do this as quick as I possibly can. Okay, so I didn't select everything. So with the lasso tool, I have this add button and subtract button. If I use the subtract, I'm able to get rid of part of a selection around here. If I select add, I'm able to kind of just add more to the selection really quick, really easy. On Photoshop, Control adds more and Alt subtracts. Okay, so now I have everything selected. Normally I would be a lot more careful than this, and you know what I've noticed, and I didn't do inside of this video here, is when you're laying down your flats, you typically want the colors to actually be obnoxious and completely different than the colors that you're actually wanting these objects to be. So for the full, I'm going to go ahead and use a fill layer, and it's going to be blue. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer and put it inside. I'm just going to stagger it inside of the full layer, and I'm just going to call this wood. All right, and with the wood layer, I can actually just use a brown color and just use the fill tool again. Okay, ta-da, done. Okay, but let's go ahead and add another layer because there's more objects attached to this telephone pole. Okay, so let's call this new layer metal, and let's use the lasso tool and click subtract and get rid of everything that's not metal. And let's just use a gray color and use the fill on all the parts that are metal. Okay, so far so good. So let's go ahead and add another layer and call it ceramic. Press Ctrl D to deselect, and I'm just going to go ahead and Control click on the full. Use the lasso tool and have it put to subtract, and I'm just going to go ahead and deselect everything that's not a ceramic piece to this power line. And I'm just going to go ahead and use a really obnoxious blue and just use the fill tool and fill it in. Okay, excellent. So here's what I'm wanting to show you guys, okay? So let's have a demonstration before the demonstration, okay? So if I have a red object on the screen right there, okay? It is a very specific shape. If I control click on it, we see that it's the exact same shape, okay? Now if I go ahead and create another layer and then another layer, and on the first layer that I created just now, I have a blue layer, I have a blue shape, and on the second layer that I just created, I have a green shape, okay? If I control click the red layer, it's the exact same shape that it was initially, okay? But if I go ahead and control click on the blue layer and then select the red layer and press delete, and then press Ctrl D and then Control click on the red layer, we see it adopted a new shape, okay? And so let's go ahead and Control click on the green layer and then select the red layer and then press delete. Press Ctrl D, Control click on the red layer, and we can see that we're able to actually use all of these shapes as stencils, okay? And stencils are extremely useful for making selections, for making sure that you mask areas off while you're just kind of doing the equivalent of spray painting, okay? Or airbrushing. So let's go ahead and delete these little layers, and let me go ahead and show you the practical use of what I just taught you there, okay? So currently we have this metal layer right here, and we have this blue layer right here. But we can see the brown going through the entire object. And there might be a time where I might want to control click on this wood and actually only select the parts that have wood on them, okay? So what I can do is I can control click on the metal layer, select the wood layer, and go ahead and press delete, okay? If I control click on the brown, I'm able to see that the selection changed from how it initially was. If I turn off the metal layer, we can see the blue that exists on the full layer that we put on initially, okay? And so we can do this again with the ceramics. Control click on the ceramic, select the wood layer, press delete, Control D, and now let me go ahead and show you something really quick here. If I grab this wood layer and pull it completely out of the group and just move it to the side, that is the shape of the wood stencil, the wood layer. Let me also press Control X in case you haven't been able to follow along here. Let me go ahead and press Control Z a bunch of times so that we have the wood as it was initially, okay, the wood layer. And let me go ahead and pull the wood layer completely out of the group and move it aside, okay? Now earlier I pressed Control X, which is cut. So let me press Control V, and we can see that we initially started out with this, and by the end we wound up with this. This process is what's called laying down your flats. Alright, and now I'm on to the main content of the video. Yeah! Now the reason why I decided to go this route with editing this video together and kind of putting a video inside of a video is because, you know, even though it's not miraculous to look at that stupid looking picture of the telephone pole and all that, I do wind up making that crappy looking drawing look kind of half decent. If you're not very good at drawing, but you're an amazing colorist, you can make a complete crap drawing look amazing and impress me. Not only that, but I wanted to have something simplistic that wouldn't be too intimidating to use to teach, and then go ahead and show the power of what it is that I'm teaching. Okay, so here I'm laying down the flats, and, I'm using the pen tool instead of using the lasso tool. This was mainly just to experiment with it, and basically, you don't have a fill to the pen tool, and so what winds up being the fill is the layer that's clipped inside of it, which is the full layer, and there are benefits and disadvantages to this, but then again, the disadvantages I've actually witnessed on occasion, totally at random, even with just, a pixel layer, using the lasso tool and everything. So I'm kind of a little bit baffled with it. So this is the disadvantage with the pen tool. After you go ahead and you select your silhouette for your flats and such with the pen tool, when you control click on, that pen tool curve layer, it just, it doesn't make any sort of selection at all. And so that was something that I had to fight throughout this entire image. I really do like using the pen tool to make selections like this, or at least to select the silhouette, but I don't think it justifies the frustration that I had. The benefit is that there are points, little portions of the composition where the line thickness isn't really that thick, and it's a heck of a lot easier to see the pen tool conforming to the exact shape of these lines that are no thicker than just a pixel thickness. And that this vector graphic is perfectly matching those pixels. You don't have anything to worry about at that point. Not only that, but one of the benefits is that you can alter the shape of the actual silhouette. If you accidentally selected things incorrectly, you could alter it but just by moving the control points and handles and such like that. So it's extra malleable in that sense. But if I were to do this image all over again, or do future images again, which I will, at least other images, I don't think that I would be using the pen tool again in order to do the initial selection of an object. Now, with this composition, I only used the pen tool for the large scale sort of silhouettes. I didn't use it for each and every little piece like a character's hair or anything like that. Another thing to kind of mention, I've seen Jazza do this a couple of times where he draws out a character design and then he uses the magic wand tool on the outside of the character, and then he presses Control-Shift-I in order to get the inverse, or the basically an inverted selection of what he had selected. Then he goes ahead and goes into this, the selection menu, and then kind of shrinks the selection by something like 2 pixels. And there have been times where that technique has worked for me, and I actually tried it out on this image as well, but I was kind of disappointed with the results in that everything has been consolidated all into one layer. And when it gets to being like that, it's not worth trying to use that shortcut. If you wind up getting line work that's all just one layer and that's it, then just use the lasso tool throughout the entire process. Don't try to do any shortcuts, because I tried a shortcut and it actually wound up working, but it actually took probably longer, if not the same amount of time as it would have taken if I just used the lasso tool. So just keep that in mind. Also, throughout the entire process of me working on this image, I'd wind up finding little things that were selected and colored red because the city is red, and that's where I did that shortcut. And it just didn't really, it just didn't work out very well. I had to keep going back and erasing things from that shortcut that I tried to take. But if you have your line work all separated out into different layers, go ahead and take shortcuts like how Jazza does inside of his videos. Each one of these colors that you're seeing is a different layer, and it's not really that graphics intensive, considering the fact that it's not like each one of these layers has like a ton of detail on them. It's just flat colors, and throughout the idea, the philosophy is that your flat colors stay flat colors from the beginning all the way to the end of the workflow. Okay, basically you have your texture layer, and then you have your your shadow and highlights layers, and that's it. And to be honest, I've seen people painting their shadows and highlights with blending modes, and I've tried that out. I've tried it out a whole bunch, and I got so frustrated with it. I even went towards working with grayscale and such for a while, and that I've I've had some success with that. You saw some of the images that I did grayscale at the beginning of the video. I've had some success, but the problem is that the colors are not the colors that I'm selecting. I mean, they're close, they're somewhat close, but like, and when you're dealing with blending modes, you're kind of at the mercy of how that blending mode operates. And this video, the main goal is to show you that you can actually pick out the exact colors that you want and have nearly absolute 100% control over your image, okay? And by the end of this video, it's going to be totally worth it. I almost guarantee it. Of course, it does depend on what your skill level is. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody out there that's like the modern day Leonardo da Vinci, and he's just possibly watching this video and thinking, amateur. I don't know. I guess I'll have to wait and see once I release the video. And another problem, other than just being beholden to the rules of a blending mode when you're doing your shadows and highlights with blending modes, is that really you wind up looking at your layers panel and it becomes this absolute nightmare. You have like 15 multiply and 15 other lighten layers, and if you find out that you've made some sort of mistake somewhere along the lines, and you made that mistake like 3 hours ago, and you've progressed like rather far ahead from that point, good luck trying to find heads or tails of that composition. Like, good luck. So, the topic of discussion is textures. How do we paint in textures? Okay, the first way that I'm going to show you is the way that I would recommend to do it, especially if your project that you're coloring is going to be a masterpiece, something amazing. And it's not as malleable, in my opinion, but it's not so graphics intensive on your computer. So you'll be able to, rest assured, you'll be able to save the file without your computer crashing, and you'll be able to open the file without your computer crashing. So this is important. So let's go ahead and create a new layer underneath the line work. Let's name it texture. And this is important, this part. Make sure you immediately change the blending mode over to overlay, alright? And then we go into our brushes and we select a texture brush, something that looks scratchy, like something that could create scratched metal. And I'm just going to go with the black for right now. The thing is texture brushes usually look really good when they're really big. Now you can make them small. There are times when they're small that they look pretty good, but it all depends on the situation and what you want in that area. And so suppose we wanted the brush to be this big because, you know, you see each version of the brush making such an interesting sort of thing going on there. But, you know, you got all of this crap going on out here that you have to kind of select and delete. That's just a lot of work. So what you can do instead is you can control click this metal layer. And what oftentimes happens, regardless of if you're using Photoshop or Affinity Photo, is you'll notice that it has both of these layers selected, the texture layer and the metal layer. And so what I like to do just to make sure, okay, oftentimes the texture layer is way up on the stacking order. So when I'm actually looking at the texture layer, the metal layer may be so far away that it's not even on the screen. So what I tend to do is I go back to the texture layer after control clicking the metal layer, and I click on a layer that's just right next to the texture layer, and then click on the texture layer itself. This is extra reassurance, and then this allows me to be able to come in and just pull out my brush and just kind of put in some scratches into the metal portions of this image here. And then you press Control D, and you know, if you control click on your texture layer, you can see that there's no part of what you did that's exceeding outside your full layer. You can see that as I'm control clicking on the full layer and back and forth to the texture layer, okay? And you know, if you need to go ahead and work on the wood, then you know, you just go ahead and go into your texture brushes and find some brush that might be able to sort of pass as being wood, I guess. This isn't how I would do wood. In fact, I kind of show how I do wood in this video. So you control click the wood layer, and I'm actually going to lower the opacity of my brush and select a brown color. And it doesn't really look fancy or anything, but that right there is one way to apply a texture on there. And then you press Control D, and so you have two textures. Oops, actually let me press Control Z a few times because I had both of these layers selected. So make sure the texture layer is selected, and then do all of that fancy texture work, and then press Control D, and there you have it. You have all of your texture stuff done. And if you need more than one or two texture layers, just go ahead and just name a texture layer texture 1, and then your second texture layer texture 2. That way, you know, you have things separated out, and you can kind of micromanage your image however way you want. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the wrong way, or at least a way that's more graphics intensive, but it's faster than what I just showed you. Okay, so you can create a new layer, you call it texture, and then you set it to being overlay, just like the last time, okay? And then you go ahead and you place it into the metal layer. You stagger it in so that it's basically going to be clipped inside of everything that's inside of the metal layer. And then, you know, you pick out your metal texture brush, and you go ahead and you paint in your textures. The only problem with this is that, you know, I control click on it, and there's all of that. When I control click on that texture layer that's clipped inside of the metal layer. Even though this isn't visible on the screen, the computer still has to process it, and the computer has to process all the 50, 60 different texture layers that you might happen to have. So the wood would be, you know, you create a new texture layer for the wood, you go ahead and clip it inside of the wood, call it texture, set it to overlay, and find a brush that might be able to pass as being wood, select a color that'll work, and then you go ahead and color in your wood texture. Okay, so it's a little bit easier to do it this way, but like I said, I came to a point inside of the main project of this video where it was almost impossible for me to save. I was kind of terrified that the computer would wind up crashing the program, and just merging layers wound up being a lengthy process. And so what I had to do when the computer got to that specific point is this, okay? So I got the texture for the wood selected right here. I control click on the actual wood layer, okay? And then I click on the texture for the wood, press Control Shift I, press delete, okay? That way when I control click, I only have brush work that's inside of the full layers selection region, okay? And then I go ahead and grab this layer here and put it underneath the line work. And you're gonna see something weird happen. Now the texture for the metal, okay? Control click the metal layer, click on the texture layer for the metal, Control Shift I, press delete, and then you click and drag this up towards the top. Alright, now this is where things start to get kind of weird. I'm going to press Control D and then press Control E. Okay, that's interesting. Sometimes colors will change. Like last time I did this, the color for the wood wound up changing colors. And if that happens, one way that you might be able to combat that is just by setting both texture layers to being set to normal, and then you go ahead and merge them and then set it to being overlay. If that happens to you, okay? I'm just saying if, because I don't want you to feel disappointed, but these are all troubleshooting steps. As much as I love Affinity Photo, I do notice that there are a few glitches that are reoccurring and are kind of really frustrating, because I wasn't able to reproduce the glitch that I just experienced in a failed attempt to record this demonstration. Now, it's important to understand that this is not the time to be doing your shadows and highlights. It's really tempting to just jump directly from doing flats to shadows and highlights, but if you do that, you're going to wind up doing things to where your image winds up looking like plastic. Everything is made out of plastic. If everything has no texture, everything looks like plastic, pure and simple. I normally actually do my photo textures around the same time that I do my actual brush texture work. And so this little segment of the speed paint is actually kind of brief, but you get to see a little bit of time devoted specifically to me texture brushing and such. Now, it's really tempting to do a lot of really complex techniques with your lasso tool and selections, Control Shift I a bunch of times, and then adding and subtracting to that selection, and Control-Shift-I again, and you're just going to confuse yourself. If you just keep your workflow simple, you're going to spend less time on it, and it's going to look just as good. I almost absolutely guarantee it. Like, there's no sense in overcomplicating the situation at all.
Okay, so back to this stupid thing again.
Oh no, not this stupid thing again.
You know, this is helpful. Even though it's a crappy drawing, it is helpful getting something that's a little bit more hands-on and clearly addressed as a tutorial, okay? So, a photo texture. So basically, if you just go around town and such like that, and you take a bunch of photographs, have a texture of something like wood somewhere around. And it just so happens that I do. So, we got this piece of wood right here, and we need to condition it so that it's ready to be a texture. Okay, so what we do is we apply a black and white adjustment layer. Okay, and what that does, if you actually notice, is it actually turns the whole picture black and white. And so what we need to do is we need to grab both the black and white adjustment layer and this wood layer and just press Ctrl G. And what I do is I go ahead and create a new layer. I put it underneath the group and I call it wood. And then I go to the group that, you know, has the adjustment layer and the picture of the wood in it, and press Ctrl E. That's the easiest way that I personally have found you can get an adjustment layer to be merged into a layer. That's the only way that I know of, at least. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and rotate this, and I'm going to set it to being overlay. Alright, and you know, you can go ahead and just clip it into the wood layer, and that works, but like I said, it's a texture, and so you probably don't want that. So it's better just to Control click on the wood layer and then press Control Shift I, click on the wood layer up here, not the actual wood layer inside of the full layer, and press delete. It's better to do that. But before you do that, let's press Control D. Let's go into the liquefy persona up here. And what's kind of cool is, you know, this liquefy punch tool, you're able to make the brush small, and you're able to kind of influence the way that things appear. Like, for example, like liquefy pinch tool. It's hard to really describe, but if I keep the mouse button pressed down, you can actually see the distortion on the texture, just creating this roundness. So that's one way that we could do that. And so you just kind of maybe increase the speed if you have to, but you won't necessarily have to every time. And what I'm doing inside of the liquefy persona at this moment might not be, I guess, very visible. So, you know, sometimes just using this liquefy push tool might be helpful in kind of sifting things around and getting a sense of roundness. You see that, right? I'm just, the liquefy push tool, the liquefy push forward tool, it's kind of getting some of these to really show as being somewhat three-dimensional and stuff like that. Kind of gets it to look kind of cool. But yeah, let's go back to this liquefy pinch tool. So if you press Alt and you click and hold, then it's actually pinching, okay? But if you don't press Alt, then it won't pinch. But you want to be a little bit careful about how you use it, because obviously, clearly, this is not the sort of distortion that I would want going on. But maybe you might want to kind of do something like that along the edge of something round. Maybe that might be able to influence things to kind of have the shapes that you want. Okay, and then you click apply, and then you're right back into the photo persona. And it's at this point that I would Control click the wood, go back to the texture wood up here, and go ahead and press Control Shift I and press delete. And at this, you know, I might even consider pressing Control E. Okay, so that didn't work. So let's oh, okay, so the texture layer was set to normal. Let's set this to being overlay. Let's see what it looks like now. Okay, see it looks good. Awesome. Okay, so generally that's one technique, but let's say you have something like a three-dimensional box, okay? How would we go about applying a texture to that and getting it to look right? Well, inside of Affinity Photo, there's a number of tools that are really cool. You can do similar sorts of things inside of Photoshop, but you know, there's this devoted tool for exactly this, the Perspective Warp tool. If it's set to the Mesh Warp tool, just click and hold and then go to the Perspective Warp tool. Okay, but we're not quite there yet. Okay, so we have this texture layer. Let's go ahead and just go ahead and throw in another piece of wood into the image. Scale it down, go ahead and add a black and white adjustment layer, group them, create a layer underneath, Control E on the group towards the new layer, that way they're merged, and let's set this to overlay so that we can actually see right through what's going on. And let's actually put this underneath the line work as well. And so now we're ready for the Perspective Warp tool, so we're able to activate it. What you would want to do is you would want to just grab these handles on the edges and try to sight them through so that they would match as best as they can to what's there in the image. And then I would click apply, and at least in this case, since I don't have any stencils, basically, I would just pull out the lasso tool, and there we have it. We have it on at least one face going towards that perspective. Let me press Control Z a few times and just right click on this layer and select copy, and then press Control Y a bunch of times to get right back to where we were. Okay, and so we can press Control V in order to paste what I just copied, and we can actually proceed. Let's press paste again and then just get this out of the canvas just a little bit, and we could do a perspective warp once again in order to address another face. And if you feel the need to zoom in and zoom out, you'll notice that the scroll bar only gets you to go up and down. Press and hold Control and use the mouse wheel, and that will actually help you out quite a bit. Now, of course, you know, I do have a stylus, but there are some things inside of Affinity Designer that's just built for a mouse, and you know, I've come to terms with that. And you know what, that looks pretty good, so I'm going to click apply. At this point, I can pull out the lasso tool and just make a few selections real quick. We can go ahead and grab this piece of wood here, and we can just finish it off with another perspective warp. That looks good to me, so I click apply. Once again, I go ahead and use the lasso tool, and we have it. We have some sort of texture on this box if we really wanted to do this. Of course, it's kind of it's not a work of art, but it's a demonstration of how you can do it. And of course, you know, if you had some sort of hieroglyphics on here of some sort, you can go into the liquify persona and kind of manipulate things a little bit, I guess, or whatever. You can actually make your brush fairly small and kind of shift the perspective of the texture that you got so that you can imply like some sort of bevel going on here. Of course, the line work isn't really doing any of this any service, but you get the idea. You can kind of distort stuff. Maybe the grain of the wood starts to spiral here, and there's this liquify twirl, and if you click and hold on it, you can actually get it to spin clockwise. Let me press Control Z, and if you press Alt, you can get it to spin counterclockwise. Alright? And so if you have a texture of, say, a character's shirt, you're able to use this twirl to get the direction of the cloth to kind of wrap around the character's body. And I do that inside of this video. I'm a little disappointed in the accuracy that I did, but I'm still happy with the result. And so that's basically how you do photo textures. So let's go ahead and resume the video. So while doing your photo textures and going into the liquify persona, or whether you're using Photoshop or whatever, and using the mesh warp tool, just make sure that you're taking great care with what you're doing in the liquify persona, okay? Because if you look at the shoulder of the nomad character inside of this image, you'll notice that some of the texture just isn't right. I'm still proud of how it turned out, primarily because this is one of the only images where I've actually even bothered to put a photo texture into the image, and I put a whole bunch of them in. And this I-beam here was a nightmare to work on, and it's because of the advice that I gave you guys earlier. Keep your selections as simplistic as humanly possible. Don't overcomplicate it. Keep it simple. Also, while I was working with the photo textures and such like that, the workflow that I was using throughout the majority of the time was actually doing the layer masking. And so I had probably about 15 to 20 layers that were all just photo textures. And it got to the point to where the program took about 5 minutes to save the file, and it kind of got me concerned that the program might crash. It got me wondering, oh boy, oh no, am I even going to be able to open this file if the program crashes? Or if I just need to open the file later on down the road? You know, it'd suck to have to wait a couple of years till, you know, the computers get better, and that's when I can open the file again. That would suck. So I spent probably about 15-20 minutes just devoted towards cutting my photo textures to the shape of the full layers and merging them all together. And it's so much easier to do the workflow that I prescribed and recommended when I was discussing working with textures and such like that. It is so important that you remember that, because it's a heck of a lot easier for your computer to handle. Okay, so we're back to this again. Now, I've done a few minor things in order to get this image up to this point, just off camera. But basically all I did is I added this gray layer behind everything, and I also added a black and white adjustment layer, which basically just kind of makes everything a little bit darker, I feel, and I set it to multiply with the blending mode, again, to make it a little bit darker so that I could do some shadows and highlights. The highlights are kind of key here. So how do you do shadows and highlights? Okay, well, you know, you can use any number of adjustment layers, but my favorites are really gradient map and recolor, depending on the context, but what I'm finding is gradient map is the most versatile. So let me go ahead and describe what the gradient map is, okay? So you have your darkest darks to the very far left here, and then you have your midtones over here. So like if I start moving this green, you'll notice that all of the darker regions of the composition wind up becoming more and more green, and as I move it further and further to the right, all the brightest areas become not so much green, but you know, there's more darkness that winds up taking up the canvas as well. So, which is kind of cool because we can change the image to just about anything that we want at any point in time. So basically, it looks weird and obnoxious and kind of daunting every time you bring it up because, you know, obnoxious, super saturated red, obnoxious, super saturated green, super obnoxious, super saturated bright blue, and all that. But let's go to the darkest darks, and let's go ahead and do the highlights real quick here. So let's go ahead and lighten this up a bit so that it's bright, and, you know, let's say that there's radiation in the scene, okay? And it's highlights, so it could be pretty saturated. So my darkest darks, I would want to have with my highlights fairly somewhat high, with the saturation at 36-ish. You know, it's different for every image, but you know, the lightness on my HSL slider, 53, sounds great. Okay, and so let's go with the mid-tone. Let's go ahead, it's already at green, so let's get the saturation kind of high and brighten this up a bit more. And for the absolute brightest brights, let's select a green hue at full saturation, full, well, almost full light. I don't like having the light at either 0 or at 100%. I'd rather have it somewhere around 95, 96-ish, or around 4 or 5, either one, depending on either end of the spectrum. That's the maximum for me. Okay, so at this point, what I can do is I can press Control I, and that gets rid of it all, because a gradient map adjustment layer works with a layer mask. So what does this mean? Well, that means that if I were to change the HSL slider, specifically with the light, if I move my L slider all the way up, I'm able to paint in some pretty bright green. And then when I slide it all the way to 0 with the L slider, I'm able to get rid of it, kind of erase. I'm even able to pull out the eraser and be able to erase. Now, that's something that's kind of helpful helpful because when I'm doing my shadows and highlights, I oftentimes have, not always, but I oftentimes have the hardness of my brush at 0%. So when it's at 0%, what happens is my brush looks all fuzzy. When it's at 100%, it looks sharp, it looks crisp. You know, clicking here and then sliding this around, or clicking here and then typing in like 50 or something like that in order to get a different type of hardness, you know, that's tedious to me. I don't like doing that. So what I can do is have a 0 hardness brush and be painting in highlights, and then I could just switch to my eraser and have a sharp eraser, you know, maximum hardness, and be able to erase some sharp lines if I really wanted to. So I'm going to select all of this and just click delete and press Shift D. So let's start with the L slider on my HSL slider at something like 26%, okay? And let's go ahead and just start putting in some color on these things here and see what this looks like. And then, okay, so that looks pretty good so far. Let's go ahead and up it to maybe 78% and kind of make the brush a little bit smaller so that some of that can show through, and we're able to kind of, if we really wanted to, we could really play with this quite a bit. And inside of the main content of the video, where, you know, you're seeing the actual practical application for these techniques and what they can do, the power of these techniques, I have the gradient map above the line work. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can always play around with your line work in a different way, but it's just something that I decided to do, and so I'm doing it here because I liked the results. I liked being able to kind of change the color of my line work, with especially the highlights. That seemed really interesting. It added a little bit of dimension to everything. Okay, so that's cool. Let's go ahead and up this to like 94% with the L slider on the HSL slider. Okay, and we can see that it's starting to get burning red hot. This is one really super radiated environment that this power line happens to be at. Okay, like this, it looks like a really creepy scene. So that's kind of cool. Let's go ahead and go and make our shadows. Okay, so let's create another gradient map. Okay, and so real quick here, let me rename the first gradient map as being gradient highlights, and then this new one that I just created, I'm going to name it gradient shadows. Okay, and so since it's a radiated environment and we have green, let's actually have the color of the sky be red. Let's say the world is still burning. Okay, and so let's keep the saturation somewhat high, so probably around 30ish. Yeah, the light somewhat around 42 sounds great. No, actually no, this is shadows, so it has to be really desaturated and really dark. So I'm going to have it around 6-ish. Sounds good to me, or maybe 4-ish. And then for the mid-tone, let's go ahead and move the L slider down to 34. Let's move the saturation slider down to something like 19 or something. This all is different for every image, okay? And of course we decided that this was going to be a red shadow, okay? Because the reflected light is going to be red because of the red sky, right? Okay, so we're going to select the highlight color and change the highlight to being red, and saturation fairly low, about 45 sounds good. And I'm going to, actually no, 45. Let's see what I had for the mid-tone really quick here. Okay, yeah, okay, I see what I'm doing. So like about 29 saturation, 33 lightness, sounds good to me. Well, let's see, highlight 40 lightness on the highlight, so that it's fairly dark. All right, so let's go ahead and pull out the brush, press Control I to get rid of it all, and let's set the lightness over here on the HSL slider at 29%. And let's just start kind of putting in kind of some basic strokes into here. Okay, it's not really showing up that much, but that's fine. And then let's go ahead and up it to like 52%, I guess. That's still not showing up really that much. Let's up it to 85. That sounds good. And yeah, now that's really showing up, and it's looking looking pretty good. Let's maybe up the saturation with the highlight, and maybe up the saturation with the mid-tone with the shadows, but we don't want it to be brighter. Okay, so that's looking good. Let's pull out the eraser. And so you just saw me influence the colors of the shadows and highlights globally throughout the entire image just now on the fly. And so this is much more versatile than what you would expect with something like trying to do this with your blending modes and such. And since my shadow gradient is above my highlights, I can just go ahead and color over my shadows and, you know, just go ahead and let the colors mix, I guess, to some extent, and see what that looks like. And we zoom out and we see we have something that's kind of momentous, I guess, but maybe the saturation is just a little too high with some of the stuff. Maybe it's just a little bit too bright with some of this stuff. So I'm going to go back to my highlights and kind of play around with the mid-tones and see what I can do with all of that. Yeah, that looks more natural. And just to show you just how much you can influence the scene, let's go ahead and change the darkest portion of our highlights to, you know, the hue over to yellow, and the mid-tone, change the hue to yellow, and the highlights, let's go ahead and shift it on over to kind of an orange sort of color. Okay, so that looks kind of interesting. Maybe we might want to improve the highlight, the mid-tones a little bit. Let's move the lightness slider up a bit. Okay, so that looks like actual normal sunlight, and we can change the gradient of our shadows. Red isn't bad for this type of light, but you know, for a blue sky, let's just start changing our dark, our mid-tone, and our highlight to being blue. And now it really actually, you know, like, even though this is a really crappy drawing, like, you look at it, and if you saw a beginner artist draw something like this, this would be impressive. So let me go ahead and show you more about what these gradient maps can do. Okay, so let me pull out my brush and use the lasso tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and select this face right here, and I'm going to have it be fairly dark, about 90% with the L slider, and maybe this face right here, maybe it might not be as dark, but it can be dark. So let's say 65%, okay? And we can go ahead and make a selection right here for this face right over to the left here, and just pull out our brush and see what that looks like. Okay, so that looks kind of cool. Let's go to our gradient highlights, press Shift D. Maybe let's see what that, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. Press Control Z, just trying to see what the color will look like. And you know, maybe I don't want this entire top surface to have full coverage with sunlight. Okay, so I can make my brush really big after having made a selection, and let's go ahead and do that. And we can actually see the brush grow, and a live preview of it. So I didn't color all over the whole thing, and since the hardness of my brush is at 0, we can see this really nice looking gradient going on here. And now, of course, you know, the edges of the line work look kind of funky, so maybe I might want to go back and kind of show that maybe the line work still has like maybe some sort of rim light, and kind of gradient it out a bit just by gradually shifting my L slider over further and further lower on the scale. Okay, and so just kind of gradienting this line just ever so much as it goes towards the darker edges. So that looks really good. All right, let's go back to our gradient shadow layer. Okay, so let's go with 99%. Let's go ahead and add some shadows to these hieroglyphics that I went ahead and created. All right, and let's say I made a screw up, okay, and it took me a long time to realize that I screwed up within this region right here. Okay, let's say it took me a long time, and it's like, oh shoot, okay, so I use the eyedropper here, and I brush. Oh no, how do I get the right value? What you do is you alt click on the gradient shadow layer, and you pull out the eyedropper right here, or color picker tool, and you color pick it, and then you click on a different layer, and then go right back up to the gradient shadow layer, pull out your brush, and you're able to, well, normally it restores it back to normal. Okay, so just trust me on that one. That's weird. It's picking up different values for some reason. It's not picking it up. What the hell? Well, if all else fails, you can always just kind of play with your L slider until you're able to find kind of a sweet spot. Something that looks like it matches. And you're able to come back and fix it. Like, in general, it's easier to match a gray color than it is to try and match an actual color. We go back and we can actually see it looks fairly good. I didn't get full coverage on here just by eyeballing the gray without the color picker. So even still, if the color picker is not working for you, you can still do things naturally. It's easier to match a gray color than it is to match hue, saturation, and light. It's easier just to work with only light in order to get the value that you want. So, you know, let's go ahead and start making this look like it's hieroglyphics and put shadows underneath here, like things are beveled. Maybe we might want to go to our highlights and kind of have like a darker highlight so that it's not as potent. And maybe we might want to make a selection here and click add up here, and maybe there might be a little bit of a highlight over here, maybe some surfaces, maybe there might be a little bit of reflected light, so maybe we might want to select a little bit of everything to some extent. Okay, so we pull out the brush and we make a really nice big brush and we kind of brush it in, and we can see that there's like a little bit of a gradient. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit brighter, maybe 50%, and just kind of brush it in, and we can actually see the result, and it looks pretty good considering the fact that this is a terrible drawing. So having this right here on the scene, I don't always have it up, but you're able to, you know, even add more nodes here, able to like add different colors, like blue light is somewhere inside of the gradient, which, you know, might actually make everything look a little bit more interesting to some extent, but most of the light is yellow and such. So food for thought. Okay, so now back to the primary content of this video. Okay, so this has been officially the longest video that I've ever made for my channel. And, you know, unfortunately, I guess I lost some footage, or I just didn't ever record any of the footage of me doing any of the shadows or something like that. But, you know, it's kind of amazing just how quickly the image starts to take shape as you just start applying the shadows and highlights. You know, there's some garbage piles in the background, and, you know, Jazza kind of drew them out kind of impressionistically, just to imply, yeah, that's garbage out in the background. And that looks fine and all that. I sometimes do something kind of similar in my workflows as well. But the thing is that I wanted there to be something that makes sense, because once you start introducing color, you need it to make sense. And so throughout the entire time that I was working with the textures, throughout the entire time that I was working with the shadows and the highlights, I was kind of doing something that was kind of close to line work, but it wasn't as crisp and as obvious as line work. And it kind of makes that whole area very fleshed out, and it's not really an area that people are going to really focus on or look at that much, but, you know, there's actual real definition there where it kind of feels like you could walk there and it makes sense. And, you know, I showed you guys earlier me doing lasso tool selections and then kind of getting my brush really big and just kind of brushing into that selection and having it look really airbrushed and stuff. The lasso tool is your kind of on the fly stencil. It's extremely effective at making this very beautiful airbrushing sort of look to your image. So don't discount the lasso tool. Really don't. If it's not looking quite right, you might have to increase the amount of pixels per inch in your image. And if you think, oh yeah, well I have like 1,000 DPI or something, DPI has nothing to do with pixels per inch. DPI is dots per inch. Like printers, all that they do is they stipple. You know, they make millions of little tiny dots that are really close to each other. So when you have like 10 billion dots per inch. First of all, there's no printer in the world that's going to have 10 billion dots per inch, and so you're probably not going to wind up with a very good looking image, and because no printer can print that way. So just, you know, it's for printing. That's what dots per inch is for. Pixels per inch, PPI, is like literally how many pixels do you have for every inch of your canvas. But, you know, I didn't have any problem with that just by opening up the PNG version of this image. I just used the default resolution, but if you're working on a personal project from scratch and all that, then you might want to do that. Here I actually added a black and white adjustment layer, and I started to kind of desaturate the image. I have a problem with having way too much saturation inside of my images, and so I just wanted to kind of tone it down a bit. And here, you know, it's not inside of Jazza's image, but I wanted to have these little solar flare sort of looks, or lens flare, I think that's what it's called. I'm kind of like J.J. Abrams. I love my lens flares. But the problem with the placement here is that it covers up the grave, and I got a critique from somebody that's kind of close to me, telling me, I don't even know what the image is about. Why is he even there? Why is there a ghost in the background? Oh, I see. There's a grave there. Okay, well, you need to move the lens flares. So I went ahead and moved the lens flares, and all that. I didn't bother recording any footage of me doing that, but it's kind of crazy because I added dust particles in the air, and I even made it so that they interact with the light physics, and it's directing your eye towards the nomad. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you guys would like to get more notifications from me or have more participation with my community, feel free to follow me on Twitter or go ahead and join my Discord. A link to both is in the video description below. If you'd like to support my channel, there's an image of my mascot in the upper right corner of the screen. It's a link to my Patreon. Any support would be much appreciated. If you've enjoyed this content and would like to see more, feel free to click on anything else that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.